Hi, I'm Gabriel Carrillo from the EdTech Bites podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Coming up on episode 197 of the House of EdTech podcast, I've got some big announcements and shout-outs, I've got an EdTech recommendation, and the rest of the episode is not a typical episode that I do. But stay right here. Strike up the band. Welcome to the House of EdTech. My name is Chris Nesi. The House of EdTech launched in 2014, giving me the opportunity to speak with teachers, leaders, and creators so you can more effectively integrate technology, strengthen your pedagogy, and have more confidence in your classroom and school so you can make an impact. Get involved with the podcast by visiting my website, chrisnesi.com. Using technology isn't difficult, and this is where it begins. This is the House of EdTech. And here I am doing another episode of the podcast for me and just for you. If you're listening to this with somebody else, hide it from them. No, I'm just kidding. Thanks for making House of EdTech a part of your anytime, anywhere professional development. Again, this is episode 197, and as I teased just a minute or so ago, I got some shout-outs, and, this episode is going to be a little different because I'm putting a little bit of a different spin on House of EdTech for this episode, but that could change. I don't know. Stay tuned. First and foremost, I want to give a very, very happy birthday shout out to my son, Miles, a multi-time guest of the podcast. Miles is 10 years old. Happy birthday to Miles. I recently had a conversation with a couple of podcasters, and I took the time to ask them, what do you like about the House of EdTech? What don't you like about the House of EdTech? And one of the gentlemen I spoke with said, well, I miss having your son on. And I will, he is due. He's in 4th grade now. He, again, is 10 years old, and it has been quite a decade. So I want to give a special birthday shout out to my son. So happy birthday, buddy. And I'm glad you're you, and I'm glad you've taken the time and given me time to be a guest here on the show. But more importantly, that I'm your dad. Thank you, son. Also, I want to give a nice shout out to Jay Strumwasser. He is at EdTechJ on Twitter, and he recently supported the podcast by buying me a soda. So thank you, Jay. I appreciate it. And if you are listening and getting value from the House of EdTech, I would appreciate it if you supported the show. And one of the ways you can do that is by going to chrisnesi.com/buymeacoffee. And thank you in advance if you're able to support the show in the future. If not, that's okay. I'm still going to make the show, as I've been doing for many years now. And again, this is episode 197, so we are very close to episode number 200. And one of the milestones that the podcast recently crossed, not as I'm recording this, but just yesterday? Yeah, yesterday this would have happened. So I'm recording this actually on Sunday, March 13th. And yesterday, while we were celebrating Miles' 10th birthday, the House of EdTech crossed the 1 million download mark. That's right. 1 million downloads of this podcast. 197 episodes now. And I mean, I know I said this a couple of episodes ago, and I don't mean to toot my own horn, but occasionally you have to toot your own horn. I knew when I started the show that I would eventually get to this because I fell in love with what podcasting is and what it can be. So I knew it was only going to be a matter of time. So even when I logged into my hosting provider, which happens to be Libsyn, and I saw the downloads and, the little animation trickled up over, 1 million downloads, I was blown away. And thank you to you, because without you listening to the show, I don't have that number. And honestly, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge deal. I make the episodes, I put them out there, and a lot of people have listened, and, my listenership has grown, and, whether you are a new listener or you are a long-time listener, I appreciate you. So thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing the show. And thank you for helping my little voice from New Jersey reach a global audience. And, this podcast has afforded me the opportunity to talk about the things that I want to talk about and also talk to the people that I want to talk to. So here's to the next 1 million downloads of the House of EdTech podcast. And it's really super cool. So thank you once again for being a part of 1 million downloads for this program. Now, let's get to the rest of the episode, and we're going to kick things off with my EdTech thought. For this House of EdTech thought, I am calling it a choice. I recently had the opportunity to interview for an admin position in another district here in New Jersey. By all accounts, the job title was perfect. Not that titles are all that important. And the job description, honestly, it was only missing my picture. Typically, I tell a long-winded story, as you might be familiar with, but I'm going to keep this one short. My interview was virtual with a panel of people from the hiring district, and I did the interview from my fancy podcast studio at the high school, and fancy podcasting gear always gets people's attention. I went into this interview with some optimism, but not very high expectations. I pretty much viewed it as an opportunity to sharpen my interview skills, and since I am gainfully employed, I didn't have any additional pressure to deal with. Again, to keep this short, I believe I nailed the interview. I was engaging, I demonstrated my knowledge, and I was able to effectively articulate my thoughts on the topics that were brought up in the interview. After the interview, I sent my customary thank you emails, and I was also able to reach out to 2 people I already knew who were on the call and members of the panel. I thanked these people, and I figured it wouldn't be long before moving on to round 2. One of the people took the time to tell me I did a great job. Then, 2 days later, I get an automated email informing me that I will not be moving on to the next round. It was a tough decision, blah, blah, blah. Things I've heard before. So I reached out to one of the people that I knew, and I said that I got my generic rejection email, and I asked where I came up short. This person told me, quote, "They moved the experienced internal admins to round 2. No areas of shortness. You were definitely authentic and very talented." End quote. Well, isn't that just great? I'm going to be vulnerable right now. I read this, the email, and I cried. I cried because while I don't know if I ultimately would have gotten the job or even taken the job, for once, I wanted to at least be faced with the choice of whether taking a new role would be the right move. But that decision was, once again, taken out of my hands. My next thought was, why did they waste the time of outside people? What would I have needed to do or say to make them keep an outside person a part of the process and considered for the position? So I asked, and my friend told me that the internal candidates were able to talk about the inner workings of the district, which they said helped. Excuse me? How would an outside candidate even begin to know the inner workings of another school district? So in the end, I'm in the same place. I will continue to teach high school history and teach courses at the college level and create this podcast for you. Not that I would have stopped. Believe me. Have you heard of anything like this? I'd love to know. If you have advice for what an external candidate can do to get hired when external candidates aren't being honestly considered, please send me an email. I would love to know what to do or potentially how to break through this. Email me, feedback@chrisnessy.com. And that's my EdTech thought. And now it's time for this episode's EdTech recommendation. And this is a fun one. Found this on TikTok. I apologize, I don't remember the user on TikTok. I normally write that down, but I'm sorry, I did not. But I want to recommend ThemeSpark by EdCourage. You can find this at ThemeSpark.net. That's ThemeSpark.net. Of course, there will be a link out in the show notes at chrisnessy.com/197. What does ThemeSpark do? It is a fast, easy K-12 teacher tool that allows you to make some great standards-based rubrics in literally less than a minute. You can choose from Common Core ELA and Math, the Next Gen Science Standards, C3, Core Art, and 21st Century Standards. You can go and check it out at ThemeSpark.net. And that's my EdTech recommendation. And now let's do the featured content. And this is the piece of the episode that, as I said at the top and in my intro, this is not my typical content. This is more education-based than education technology-based. So here goes. Earlier this week, I saw a very interesting story that popped up on Twitter and, a couple of other various outlets. I think I first saw it on Facebook. And if this hasn't made its way onto your newsfeed, well, then I'm breaking news for you. But earlier this week, there was an assistant principal, Toby Price. He's an assistant principal he was an assistant principal at an elementary school in Mississippi. And he read the book, I Need a New Butt, to some children. And he was fired for reading this children's book, this acclaimed children's book to children, I believe over a Zoom call, bunch of second graders. And this struck a nerve with me because this is almost 1,000% what's wrong with education. That this assistant principal, who by all accounts is well respected, cares about children, and is doing a hell of a job as an administrator, was fired for stepping up. So I want to share with you this article from the New York Times. So if you've read it, you may want to skip through this, but if you want to hear this story, I hope you will, because this man was wronged and it's not right. So I want to make sure I share his story and we'll see where it goes from there. Okay. So the headline from the New York Times, this was published on Friday, March 11th. An educator read, I Need a New Butt to children. Then he was fired. Toby Price, an assistant principal at an elementary school in Mississippi, read the book to a class of second graders over Zoom. Quote, I am a firm believer that reluctant readers need the silly, funny books to hook them in, end quote, he said. So this article was written by Maria Kramer and Isabella Grullon-Paz. Here we go. It was Read Across America Week, and the second graders in the Hinds County School District in Mississippi were waiting for an administrator to read to them. The administrator had forgotten it was her turn, said Toby Price, the assistant principal at Gary Road Elementary School in Hinds County, who was in his office at the time. He decided to fill in. Mr. Price, 46, quickly grabbed a book, I Need a New Butt, by Dawn McMillan, one of his children's favorites, and began reading it to roughly 240 second graders over Zoom. Later that day, on March 2nd, the district superintendent, Delacecia Martin, called him into her office and told him he was on administrative leave, Mr. Price said. He was fired 2 days later, accused of violating the Standards of Conduct section of the Mississippi Educator Code of Ethics. In a letter to Mr. Price, the superintendent called the book, quote, inappropriate, end quote. She particularly took issue with the references to farting in the story and how, quote, the book described butts in various colors, shapes, and sizes. For example, fireproof, bulletproof, bomb-proof, end quote. Miss Martin called Mr. Price, quote unquote, unprofessional for having selected the book. I expected a write-up, said Mr. Price, who had worked for the district for 3 years. I did not expect to get terminated. I cried the entire way home. Mr. Price, who has been an educator for 20 years, said he had hired a lawyer and planned to fight the termination before the school board. Ms. Martin and the 5-member school board did not immediately respond to messages seeking comment on Friday, but Mr. Price's termination brought swift criticism from children's authors and PEN America, a free speech organization that fights bans against books. In a letter, PEN America said, quote, "In positioning the act of reading a book as a violation of ethics, the district is implying that any educator could be terminated under similar circumstances," end quote. A fear that many teachers are already grappling with after a slew of Republican-led efforts last fall to ban books from teaching and discussing race, racism, and other quote-unquote divisive concepts. On the elementary school's Facebook page, the grandmother of one of the students at the school posted a news story about Mr. Price's termination, and she said she planned to speak on his behalf before the school board and fight to get his job back. The grandmother said, quote, "My granddaughter heard him read the book and thought it was hilarious and not at all inappropriate," the grandmother wrote. Mr. Price said that was the reaction from students after he read the book. He recalled going into the hallway and being approached by students who thanked him for his pick. "They loved it," he said. "They all stopped me and said, 'Mr. Price, that book was really good.'" The Hinds County School District is about 5,500 students and 425 teachers and covers half a dozen towns near Jackson, Mississippi. More than 21% of the general population in Hinds County lives under the poverty line, well above the national average, according to Data USA. Mr. Price said it was particularly critical to teach literacy at his school, where many children rely on free lunches or reduced price meals. He said, "We have a lot of reluctant readers. I am a firm believer that reluctant readers need the silly, funny books to hook them in. I Need a New Butt," which was published in 2012, is marketed to children ages 4 to 8 and tells the story of a young boy who sets off to find a new behind after he sees a crack in his and fears it's broken. I just want to break in for a second here. My children, Miles and Colton, also love this book, and I think it's hysterical. Back to the article. When he was called into the superintendent's office, he said that one of the administrators asked him, quote, "Is this the kind of thing you find funny?" Mr. Price replied, "Well, I did before I walked in here." He said he wanted only his job back so he could support his 3 children. His 2 oldest children, a daughter who's 19 and a son who's 18, have severe autism. And the article ends with a quote from Price, "I'm tired, I'm stressed, I'm overwhelmed. I need to work." Here's my thoughts on this. I know Toby on Twitter. He's a good guy. My opinion, this man did nothing wrong. And I'm sure that many people who are aware of this would agree. I hope that you agree as well. If you don't agree with me, I'm going to be honest, unsubscribe from this show. Don't follow me anymore. Don't have anything to do with me, because this guy is getting screwed. And I'm going to also be honest and say, I hope he fights to get compensated, and, the damages and, the anxiety and the mental health toll that this is going to take on him. But I hope he doesn't fight to get his job back in this district, because this district, to me, has shown him that they are not good for him. He deserves better than this district. This superintendent, this Board of Education, they are wrong. I don't know how else to put it. I'm trying to keep some sense of calm, but I read this and I got angry because it's not right. Forget the pandemic. I'm sure that this was probably going to be an issue no matter when it happened. But it's just super frustrating. Okay. I don't know too much of what else to say other than go connect with him on Twitter. His username is @JediPadmaster. And of course I will link to that in the show notes, but send him a kind word. He does have a GoFundMe set up to just kind of help out during this tough time. As if being an educator wasn't tough enough, we now have to worry about what children's books we are reading. And one of the thoughts that I put out into the ether that is social media and Twitter was maybe we as educators, we should organize a national I Need a New Butt Day, and as many teachers as possible everywhere at every grade level, at any grade level, read this book to our students. Because for this to be a fireable offense is laughable, but not the good kind of laughter that he encouraged over 200 second graders to experience, right? He stepped up when another administrator failed to even remember that they were supposed to read to kids, and he stepped up. He's done nothing wrong, and I wish Toby nothing but continued success in his career, and that he finds a district that appreciates what he can offer children as an administrator. That's my featured content. I would love to know your thoughts at Mr. Nessie on Twitter, at House of EdTech on Instagram, and, I support you, Toby. So that's all I got. And before we bid adieu to episode 197, I want to share with you the latest House of EdTech VIP, and I want to give a shout out to Miss Emilee Phillippi, or Phillippi. I'm not sure. I'm going to go with Phillippi. So Emily is on Twitter. She is at Emilee Phillippi. That's EmeleePhillippi. Don't worry, I'll put a link in the show notes. You can also probably swipe in your podcatcher and get a link, connect with Emily on Twitter. She is intellectually curious. She is a passionate teacher and analyst, and she is a lover of all things OSINT. So connect with her on Twitter. She definitely deserves to have more people following her. So let's go follow her. If you follow me, go follow Emily. And congratulations, Emily. You are a House of EdTech VIP. Thank you, as always, for listening to the House of EdTech podcast. If you're not subscribed or following the show, I hope you'll continue to make this part of your anytime, anywhere professional development. I hope you go and check out the EdTech recommendation for this episode, which was, again, ThemeSpark by EdCourage. If you've got any words of wisdom from me on how to interview when you're not actually being considered for a job, I would love to know. My frustration has turned into laughter at this point, so I'm doing okay. You don't have to feel bad for me, but certainly I'm open to advice and help. If you enjoyed what I talked about today, and again, this episode had a little bit of a different spin and a different flavor, more education than the technology, which I think is important, and I might start to do more of here on the show. Let me know. Keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts on what we talked about, what's going on in your mind with Toby. What do you think? Let me know. Leave a comment on the show notes at chrisnessie.com/197. You can send me an email. Go to chrisnessie.com/feedback, or you can send a voicemail, which I would love to get some voicemails here on the show. Go to chrisnessie.com/voicemail. Now, if you enjoy the House of EdTech, you can do two favors for me. Number one, and this is the most important thing, tell somebody else about the podcast. Word of mouth is the best way to share a podcast that you enjoy. You can share it by showing somebody how to subscribe to it, send them the link to the episode, just talk about it. Go talk to your neighbor across the hall. That would be awesome. You could also become an awesome supporter. I'm very thankful for the ongoing financial support of the following people: Anthony Arnaud, Dan Gallagher, Carlos Garza, Peggy George, Jeff Herb, Mike Messner, Matt Miller, JP Presevento, Patty Reefus, Lori Simpson, and Kyle Wilcox. If you are getting value from the podcast, you can become an awesome supporter by going to chrisnessie.com/awesome. The next episode of the House of EdTech is going to be episode 198, and that is going to be the 2022 House of EdTech Final Four, the original EdTech tournament. That's going to come your way on March 27th, 2022. I look forward to bringing it to you. So look for it in your podcatcher in a couple weeks. Hope all is well. Until next time, thank you for learning with me. And remember, using technology isn't difficult. Just give it a try.
Bye.